Around the world, protesters are taking drastic action to demand governments act to prevent a climate crisis.
What is worth more, art or life?
I'm here because I don't have a future.
The largest chapter of human suffering.
Over 20% of the landmass of this planet becoming uninhabitable.
At the moment, the human race is unlikely to survive.
I now invite the Secretary General of the United Nations, His Excellency Antonio Guterres, to make a statement.
And world leaders too are warning that radical changes are required if civilization and humanity are to survive.
The climate crisis is a code red for humanity.
We are digging our own graves.
Humanity has become a weapon of mass extinction.
We are in the fight of our lives and we are losing. Humanity has a choice: cooperate or perish. It is either a climate solidarity pact or a collective suicide pact.
Wild weather rages around the world. These pictures just a snapshot of what's happened within the last 48 hours alone.
They believe that unless climate change is stopped, society will be destroyed by storms, floods, droughts and famines.
Human behaviour is unequivocally warming our planet, driving many of these extreme conditions. The UN says this is a code red for humanity, and there is nowhere to hide.
In every region in the world, climate and weather extremes have changed because of human influence.
The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says that many of the consequences of global warming, like rising sea levels, are already irreversible.
But what evidence of a climate crisis exists?
The climate crisis isn't a problem of the future. We're seeing the catastrophic effects of it right now.
The destruction of hundreds of millions of livelihoods.
In every region of the world, people have become wealthier.
We're talking about the end of human civilization as we know it. We're talking about total social collapse.
The number of people living in poverty has fallen.
So the question that we all have to answer now is, how many dead babies are we comfortable with?
Rates of infant mortality have dropped.
And pensioners dying before they should.
Life expectancy has increased.
We're likely to see more pandemics as the crisis worsens, as climate change worsens.
And the number of deaths from communicable diseases is at an historic low.
We are facing an era of multiple breadbasket failure.
In all parts of the world and at all levels of development, agricultural productivity has increased.
Crops are failing now all across the planet.
And farmland now occupies a smaller area despite supporting a much larger global population.
That's 250,000 children under the age of 5 died from starvation in East African countries affected by climate change.
Malnutrition claims a fraction of the number of lives that it used to.
Human activities are causing climate change and making extreme weather events more frequent and severe.
There is no increase in the frequency or intensity of storms.
People should stop thinking about these floods as a once-in-a-century event. Floods like this are going to happen more often.
Weather-related natural disasters kill a fraction of the number of people that used to be killed, despite a quadrupling of the global population.
We have no choice. Already every 6 seconds somebody is dying due to heat waves.
The number of people who lose their life to temperature extremes has fallen.
Island nations going underwater.
Rather than sinking beneath rising seas, low-lying island states have increased their area.
Millions displaced from their low-lying seabed countries.
And low-lying states such as Bangladesh have also grown and become less vulnerable to floods, despite being a poster child for climate change. And Bangladesh's population and their wealth have also increased. The world's population is healthier, wealthier, better fed and safer than it ever has been. And most of this progress has been achieved in the last few decades, the era of global warming and climate change. If there was a climate crisis, none of these facts would be true.
This is insane.
Global climate crisis here, now, and lethal. Months and time zones apart, but parts of the same human-induced crisis.
So if there is no evidence of a climate crisis happening, why do so many people believe that it is? The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, which compiles the scientific evidence about climate change to produce a consensus, makes no statement about a climate crisis.
The next 10 years, to 2030, must see the most profound transformation the world has ever known.
The idea of a climate crisis is not scientific. It is a political idea, and it is used to make political arguments.
Basically, the financial system held a mirror to the climate crisis.
What protest does is to hold a mirror up to society.
These seemingly arcane but essential changes to the plumbing of finance can move and are moving climate change from the fringes to the forefront and transforming the financial system.
We need systemic change.
Banks, insurers, pension funds, asset managers, export credit agencies, stock exchanges, credit rating agencies, index providers, auditors.
That is an essential step towards change.
So make no mistake, the money is here.
System change, not climate change.
Thank you very much.
But it is necessary for there to be a crisis to legitimise the radical and far-reaching changes to society that will be created by the climate policies that green ideologues want. Without a climate crisis, climate policies have no legitimacy, and the chain of reasoning between global warming science and climate policy is broken. Observational science has produced reasonable evidence that the world is warming in response to increased atmospheric concentrations of CO2. But evidence for claims that the climate is changing because of global warming is more mixed. There seems to be slightly more precipitation and more heat waves as global warming science predicts. But as we have seen, there have not been more storms. And other claims, such as that there have been increases in drought and sea ice loss, also either lack evidence or have been wildly exaggerated. This lack of evidence has made it extremely difficult for climate researchers to identify climate impacts, the assumed consequences of global warming and climate change. Despite claims that our world is on fire, observations by NASA show a fall in the global burned area. And the IPCC finds no trends in floods linked to climate change, and the number of people affected by floods in recent decades has fallen. And when claims that species are in decline are examined, it turns out that dire reports of nature collapsing are also false. Studies that claim that the world has lost 2/3 of its vertebrates since the 1970s were driven by just 2.4% of the 14,700 species studied. When those species, which are in decline but which are just a small number of the total, are excluded from the analysis, the world's population of wild animals is revealed to be in very good health. There is a gap in the chain of reasoning between science and policy. There is little evidence of climate impacts, and there is no evidence of a climate crisis.
He is here today to represent the voice of the people. Please welcome Sir David Attenborough. Sir, you have the floor.
Some have claimed that the sustained improvement of human welfare, despite a rapidly deteriorating environment, is a paradox.
We're facing a man-made disaster of global scale, our greatest threat in thousands of years. That our civilizations arose in large part because of the last 12,000-year period of climatic stability, known as the Holocene, which allowed humans to settle and farm.
They believe that technological progress and economic development are unsustainable.
We've taken that stability for granted. Our economies and political systems are unconsciously predicated on the belief that nature will continue to be a benign and regular provider of the conditions we need to thrive.
But this long-standing belief has no foundation in evidence. Evidence contradicts the belief.
And our stable, reliable planet no longer exists. The impacts of this destabilization will profoundly impact every country on Earth.
Environmentalists' belief that the natural world is deteriorating and that human civilization is dependent on the natural world is ideological, not scientific, objective, or evidence-based.
I'm talking about the slaughter, death and starvation of 6 billion people this century. That's what the science predicts. That's the trajectory we're on. And that requires absolutely desperate measures to stop it.
Earth systems are complex systems. They absorb stress to a certain amount and then they suddenly flip over into a state where we just won't be able to survive in most parts of the world. I have 2 children and, every day I think, did I do the right thing?
They believe that human society depends on natural processes, life support systems.
Without nature, we have nothing. Without nature, we are nothing.
And they believe that the systems that comprise the natural world exist in an extremely sensitive balance, changes to which will cause an angry and catastrophic response from nature.
We're actually pushing the entire Earth system to a point of destabilization. Push them too far, and they will shift over from supporting humanity to starting to undermine humanity.
And they believe, accordingly, that society must be organized in such a way as to reflect the design of the natural order as they see it, or human civilization will collapse.
This is a planetary crisis.
Meeting minimum needs within these Earth system boundaries will require just transformation, innovation, and redistribution.
Their ideological beliefs are false. Environmental change may cause problems, but change is not equivalent to environmental destruction, and climate change is not equivalent to a climate crisis. Human society increasingly depends on our own industries, not on nature, for sustenance. Our self-dependence has made it possible for populations to grow and to reduce the physical footprint of agriculture. As we have turned away from dependence on the natural world for food, energy and materials, the rate of deforestation has reversed in most industrialized and growing economies, just as whale populations recovered from the era of whaling when science and technology provided alternatives. It is ideology that obscures the gap made by the absence of observational evidence between global warming science and climate policy, allowing claims that climate change and climate crisis are equivalent. The real paradox is that environmental ideology will reverse this progress, making us more dependent on nature and therefore increasing both our environmental impact and our vulnerability to environmental changes. Faced with the facts that civilization, rather than being dependent on nature and facing an existential crisis, is becoming healthier, wealthier, and safer, climate scientists and researchers turned their backs on observational evidence. They had been tasked with making the case for far-reaching policies that will completely transform the economy and our ways of life. But without evidence in the real world supporting alarmist predictions, scientists have been unable to support politicians' and activists' claims.
A new report found a recent heat wave in Siberia was, quote, essentially impossible without human-caused climate change.
So instead of using evidence from the real world, they created computer simulations to give scientific authority to ideological stories of a looming catastrophe.
To put that into perspective, the study found a climate compared to that of the year 1900 with less pollution would see an event like this occurring only every 80,000 years.
Record-breaking heatwaves in northwest India and Pakistan are 100 times more likely because of climate change. That's according to a Met Office study.
They developed a new science called Attribution, which they claimed could detect mankind's fingerprints on extreme weather events.
Climate science about man-made climate change is very robust. A lot of detection and attribution studies have found that human-induced climate change and our emissions of greenhouse gases has made some extreme weather events such as heat waves and sometimes storms more likely.
What used to be your 1 in a 100-year event that you might have used as a benchmark to prepare your systems has changed and is now more intense.
This is just some of the devastation caused by the extreme heat. And now, according to new research, that blistering heat wave was made at least 10 times more likely because of climate change.
Whenever a natural disaster featured in the global news, scientists used their models and this science of attribution to claim that CO2 emissions had made the event more likely.
My name is Richard Horton and I'm editor of The Lancet. The climate emergency that we're facing today is the most important existential crisis facing the human species.
The Lancet Countdown, tracking progress on health and climate change, places a finger on the pulse of this vital issue.
And despite the fact that fewer people were being affected by climate change, researchers in other fields such as medicine added their academic voices to claims that the risks of climate change were increasing. Though their own evidence showed that far fewer people are experiencing diseases linked to climate change, doctors claimed that compared to a hypothetical world in which there is no climate change, more people are suffering in the real world, therefore climate change risks are increasing. These experts have used the authority of institutional science and medicine to convince people that a climate crisis is happening, despite there being no scientific observational evidence for it. And this misuse of institutional authority has in turn been used to close down public, democratic debate about far-reaching policy and to silence critics of the green agenda. But computer simulations and hypothetical worlds are not reality and not evidence. They are science fiction, and they are used to mislead people into believing that there is a climate crisis so that they may support radical climate policies.
I'm worried about lots of animals that live in cold places, like polar bears, for example.
What do you see as the tools, the next tools that you could utilize to try to create change?
Children.
There's only one world. If we destroy it all, then we have no other place to live.
I think we have to sensitize the young and tell them how their future is going to be affected if we don't take action today.
Right now, we are not acting. We should act now.
And do you have children?
I've got children.
Do you love those children?
Indigo.
How much do they pay you to betray your children's future? What's your price?
Do you love those children more than you love fossil fuels?
You're a traitor to the British people. You're a traitor to your daughter.
And I'm murdering my child.
Oil destroys everything.
And I think if we can get them to understand the seriousness of the problem, they would probably shame adults into taking the right steps.
There is a growing risk to our economy, our health, our food supply and our safety, but not from the weather or climate. That risk is from policy based on the idea of a climate crisis which is keeping and making people poor by making energy more expensive and by increasing the cost to industries and businesses, pushing up prices for ordinary people. Global warming and climate change are real, but climate policy is the far more real and more dangerous threat than climate change. The world has seen unprecedented progress in recent decades, and much more needs to be done to eliminate problems such as poverty and disease. But by failing to confront green scaremongering, global agencies, world leaders, politicians, scientists, and the media have allowed a dark and dangerous ideology to fester, causing a widespread ignorance of this progress, which it now threatens to reverse. Green scaremongering will turn the clock back for humanity and civilization.